So one of the new features, if you've been following the Final Fantasy XVI coverage, is there is a new way that they're running uh, accessibility for story, and that is by having a little button that lets you bring up an active time lore system, which tells you roughly what's going on in the scene, what the connections are, and why it's important, as well as like any other little bits that might be interesting to know about. And it got me thinking about how interesting it is that they're working on accessibility of story. And it made me more interested in thinking about how it could be used to improve a whole bunch of other games that oftentimes let their story get overly complicated and hidden behind means that are not the most helpful. And this leads me to Final Fantasy XIII because I think that game probably could have benefited a lot from that, just from me personally. But I was just wondering, are there any other games that any of you have played where a story has needed to be more accessible in order to be understandable?
So sorry,
I mean,
I haven't really been following, but what does the active lore button do?
it brings up a little bit of a. It's like 5 bubbles maximum, and it tells you about the characters who are important in a scene. It tells you where the scene is located and why that scene is happening in that location, and it'll give you like other little tidbits as well.
So
Oh, so
basically,
is
it's
it,
like
So it's
it's
kind of,
just borrowed from the visual novel way of doing things.
yeah,
Because
probably.
basically, all visual novels have like a system where a key term is used in the text, and then you can actually pull up a little glossary just from clicking on that term, which will explain it in context and stuff. So yeah, I think that's where Final Fantasy 16 probably got that idea from, which is neat. I think that's useful because otherwise, yeah, some games can get overly convoluted with their own lore and backstories and stuff. Final Fantasy 13 is a good example of that. I mean, I love that game, but it certainly required people to be fairly tuned into their literature to get along with it.
yeah, and these are really long games as well. Like if you were to write out the script for most of these games, I think like probably more than 1 million words or so, right? If you were to count every NPC interaction, every cutscene, every character thing, like it's orders of magnitude larger than your standard fantasy series from the bookstore.
Pretty much. I mean, it does. Video games are a relatively inefficient way of telling a story, which sounds strange, I know, but they
A
do tend to,
game website reviewer.
they do tend to require more words to convey their stories, and yeah, in amongst everything else, they are a fairly inefficient storytelling medium. So um, I think the idea of giving people the glossary or some help to remind themselves of what key characters are and key bits of the in-game history and whatever is a good idea. Um, the thing is, though, I would say that a lot of games are that simple in terms of the story that they don't really need that. Like, for example, nobody needs a glossary in The Last of Us or Uncharted or God of War or whatever, because those games are all quite straightforward and blunt in terms of the way they tell their stories. So I
Hmm.
think the challenge is when you're trying to create a story that has complexity to it. And I guess that's why I'm quite looking forward to seeing what Final Fantasy 16 story is really like. If it actually needs that glossary, does that mean it is a more complex story? Um, and that would be good for me if it is, because I do like my stories to be complex.
Yeah, it's exciting to see that they're going for something clearly, but they're also not leaving anyone behind. And
Yeah.
you know,
I can
Which
name so
probably,
many RPGs that I've just stopped playing because midway through I pick it up after a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And then a character says a line and I go, I don't know what half these words mean.
yeah, and that was the issue with like I'm playing Lost Odyssey at the moment on my stream, and because I'm playing it once a week, there are times where it will say something and I will just not understand, and it will make me frustrated, and I'll feel like a dumb idiot, and it makes me feel sad, so I don't want to play the game anymore. Which is such a odd position to take on it, but
Isn't the point
yeah,
of the point of Lost Odyssey is just to collect those little stories, isn't it? That's the whole point of that game.
those stories are really, really good. But
They
because we're
are.
doing it and we're doing it as a drinking thing, it's so hard to get invested in them because they're not narrated, and it's really, really tough.
Wait,
Plus,
how'd you
like
make a
half the
drinking game
game
out of
is
Lost Odyssey?
every time that you want to stop playing the game, you drink. It's there are some really bad sections of that game. For those of you who've not played it, it's pretty good overall. I'm taking the piss out of it, but it is a pretty decent game.
Isn't it
The
like one
issue
of the
is just
most
that
respected RPGs of all time?
It
I
is.
wouldn't say respected. I'd say
Alan's
it's
just not
done
playing
pretty
it in
well.
Alan's just not playing it in the right context.
No, the
it's
story
not
is
a
really
game.
Play it
interesting. I love.
sober.
It's not a game for.
No,
Yes, it is not a game to be playing when drinking, and it is not a game to be playing on stream. It's a game to be sitting down to, like a good book, maybe with a glass of red wine, but certainly not a shitload of alcohol. And you're meant to concentrate on it, Alan. You're meant to
no,
concentrate.
I am. No, the issue is not that. The issue is
You're
the
playing it
gameplay
wrong.
is really bad sometimes. I'm playing it wrong.
You're playing it
Everyone,
wrong.
I'm playing
you
it
naughty,
wrong.
naughty man.
But Jansen's so good. He's such a good boy. I love Jansen. He's
I
my
do love
favorite
him.
character in an RPG so far. He's such a fucking insane dude.
It annoys me endlessly that Game Pass doesn't have Lost Odyssey on it because goddamn Microsoft owns
It's
the
so
rights for it,
good.
and that would get me to sign up for Game Pass if I could stream that thing from anywhere in the world on my little handhelds that do the Android thing. That would be great, but they don't. The bastards.
It's like that and Blue Dragon are stuck on the Xbox, and it's such a shame.
It
Yeah, there's
really
a lot
is.
of like very good, very lost RPGs that are just languishing right now.
Yeah,
But going back
I
to
wish
the
there was
point,
a thing to.
the
Yeah, I wish there
Xenoblade,
was a way that I could understand Jansen more and more with the
the
dialogue wheel.
the Xenoblade Chronicles games could use that glossary
Oh God,
approach.
no,
Definitely,
it's so
yes.
correct. Jesus Christ.
But
Ugh.
Xenoblade Chronicles has a specific problem where it uses normal English words but makes them into proper nouns. So it's just even harder to understand because they haven't thought
No,
about how a
that's
human
so
being would talk.
Oh God.
Like, why would you call it a blade if your characters have swords, but a blade is also a thing that you summon to fight for? It's so stupid.
It's not.
No,
yeah,
what really?
the thing is that Xenoblade Chronicles, the trilogy plus X, all four of them, they're all very good narrative games, but they really are dense in
Phenomenal.
they're quite dense in their lore, and that makes it difficult to follow along unless you're prepared to sit down and basically that is the only game you play for while you're playing it. As soon as you take a break to play something else, you lose a lot of what makes those games quite special. And I've felt that myself, that for example, I was playing Xenoblade Chronicles, the original one on the Switch when they re-released it to try and catch up. I got to a point and then I had to go and play something else for review and whatever. And yeah, when I stepped back into Xenoblade Chronicles, I was just lost. I'd already played the game so many times, I knew exactly where I was in the game, and I already knew the kind of the general story. But even then, I was still struggling to reconnect with the specifics of it. So that is a good example of a game that probably could have used the glossary or some kind of approach to make it's not that they have to make the story simpler, because I don't want that. I definitely don't want the games to dumb themselves down to try and make sure that nobody gets lost in them or whatever. But I do want there to be some way, especially the lore heavy games, the games that have intricate backstories and this massive world that is kind of fantasy and therefore not connected to the real world. I definitely want them to find some way of making sure that players can reconnect with it if they've taken a break, or if there's something that they've forgotten about, which a lot of them struggle with.
Great mechanic, a really good mechanic that I can't understand why it was never revisited. But if anyone remembers the old Fire Red and Leaf Green Pokemon remake from the Game Boy Advance, what it would do was
It showed you what you recently did.
Yes, every time you close the game, you
the
save
little,
it, you turn it off,
the little refresh.
and you turn it back on.
Yeah.
It tells you here are the last 5 things you did since you played last time. And I
Yeah,
don't understand why more games don't do that when you turn it on and just go, here's what you did last time you were here.
that was a neat thing for sure.
Or like something just to like remind you where you are and why you're here. Otherwise, you stop midway. And I think the other thing too is that a lot of the old games had save points, which meant that they could actually control where you started and stopped playing. And it meant that you probably wouldn't be as lost because when you come back in, there would be a cutscene or a boss fight or a town or something to kind of like fill you in on what your current goal is. Whereas nowadays, because it's auto save, you can save wherever you want, you can stop wherever you want. It now becomes more of an issue because you could just be midway through this big plot scene that the game knows that they want you to pay attention, but you're just thinking, oh, it's 11 o'clock. I want to go to bed now.
Yeah,
I like
yeah.
that a lot, actually. I do wish there was some way that they could say, like, last time on Dragon Ball Z, but for every game.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
It would make it so much easier.
I think it would allow the developers to do more with the stories too. Because I think to go back to Final Fantasy 13, especially the two sequels, 13-2 and Lightning Returns, those games really kind of hurt themselves, not because they were they were too complex, I guess. It's which meant that a lot of people found them confusing or didn't make sense. That was a common thing that popped up in reviews and whatever. The narrative doesn't make sense or whatever. The narrative makes sense. It's a really bloody hard narrative to
It's
connect
just
with.
impenetrable, yeah.
And
Yeah, they also came
I
out like
would
a
rather,
trench of games critique too, where like
yeah, I mean,
reviewers did not want difficult stories.
well, no, what I'm saying is I want that in games. I want games to be able to tell those really complex stories because I feel like that's important to the storytelling medium as well, that you have some
Mm.
examples of complex stories. You got it in literature, you've got it in film, you've got some examples of really complex storytelling in there. And that's important to push the medium forward, to give people things to think about. And as an art form, you need that. But if they're going to just completely undermine themselves to the point that Lightning Return sells like 100,000 copies or something, it was an absolute bomb of a game, despite being a Final Fantasy game. If you're going to undermine yourself to do that, then you're not going to be incentivized to create complex stories. So they do need to find a solution, and yeah, this Final Fantasy 16 might be that solution. Not that I'm saying that that's going to be a complex story. I don't know. I haven't played it yet, but if it is, and if the glossary is the solution to that, then that's brilliant as far as I'm concerned.
Mm.
It's the
What
way
would
to
you
do it, like,
recommend as a
genuinely.
game? If someone came to you and they were like, I really want to like thematically and narratively and just world-wise complex game, what would you recommend somebody?
Well, I mean, the plague is a good example of that.
The
Plague,
Plague?
pandemic,
With logic.
pathologic. That's it. Pathologic 2. Pathologic
I'll
2.
just be like, why are you
I was gonna
recommending me the
say,
Plague? No one likes the
That's like
Plague.
what?
three different
No,
Does
you
games.
know,
everyone die?
you know how I was thinking about that because the plague is like the book, the Albert Camus book,
Yeah.
and
Oh, okay.
it's
Yeah.
a very good book about exactly the same thing as basically as Pathologic 2. So I see
Yeah.
them and some of you could do a side by side study of them, and that would be a fascinating thing to
On a
do.
similar vibe as that as well. The Void, also made by the same developers, Ice Pick Lodge. The Void is the most fucking insane, complex shit that I've seen in a while as well.
Yeah, these are
That's a fun
very
game.
complex and to their detriment. I mean, I think a lot of
They are
people,
impenetrable.
yeah, a lot of people would start to play them, put them down after about 10 minutes and never feel the need to go back to them. But they are very
I'd
complex
also,
narratives.
I'd say Arcanum as well. I don't know if any of you played Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. That game's
I've heard of
also
that.
like got a lot going on, and it's very cool. And it has a lot of like very interesting little story bits that are very easy to get lost in because the world is so fleshed out. And it's one of those things where it expects you to play it multiple times, and then you'll understand everything. But I
Hmm.
don't know. That game's pretty cool for that too.
And I mean, in another
Easy
way,
sell.
another example of incredibly complex storytelling is what From Software does with all of its games these days. You don't necessarily really experience that until you're ready to start to delve into the story, but Elden Ring in particular is a pretty complex storytelling experience. And I think that's another interesting way of doing it, that on the surface, it's all quite straightforward and you can play the game without necessarily delving deeply into it and still get to the end and have a good time with it or whatever. But if you want to understand Elden Ring, the amount of work you have to do is really quite interesting. So for me, that's another good
The
example of
difference is
storytelling.
the difference is with that though, is that like Elden Ring, the gameplay is still always the focus. Whereas in something like FF13, the
I
focus is not really the gameplay, I would argue. It's the
Yeah,
story.
definitely.
And because you need to sort of put the work in with 13 to understand the story, it feels less, I don't know, like less fair almost.
I don't know. It's
I don't know
because
how to
for
explain this. I
me,
don't know how to explain how I'm trying to say this, but yeah,
Elden Ring was about the story right from the start. Like I never thought of it as, I thought the gameplay is obviously excellent, but I wasn't playing for the gameplay. Maybe I'm in a very small minority, but I was definitely playing for the
I think
story.
you might be in a minority at that.
Yeah, I
The
feel
the
like most
difference,
people who played FromSoft games, they experience the stories through like explain on YouTube videos.
We watched videos like 3 days after beating the game, being like, "Oh, that's what it was about."
Yeah, they're very good videos, but like they do the role
Great
of what
videos.
the catch up would be for Final Fantasy 16. I think it's really a case of Square Enix making it in house rather than hoping someone's gonna make an explainer video on YouTube of what the narrative really is.
It's like you
Yeah,
look up on YouTube, it's like, ah, yes, it was actually about capitalism and like, murdering the,
it
homeless
always was
and
about
like,
capitalism.
Everything's about capitalism, Trent.
Let's talk
It's
about a
true.
good From Software game, the Lost Kingdom series. I'm fairly sure that was very story driven and very confusing, if I'm remembering correctly. It was like very text heavy and
The
not
Lost
It's
really.
the
Kingdom
Lost
No,
Kingdom
series.
series.
no,
I've
it was
I've
one
Which
and
one was
two.
that?
I went through Lost Kingdoms one, actually not that long ago, on via emulation, and no, it's not really
I played
no,
two first though. That's
it's not
probably the
it's
problem.
not very narratively complex. It's actually quite level designed, and yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say it was a complex narrative. Good games,
There's
but
also
yeah,
we have to consider the difference between like a deep narrative and a complex narrative. A deep
Yeah,
narrative is one where like thematically there's a lot of different things going on and you can discuss it a lot. But a complex narrative is one that just has a lot of information that you need to take in before you can truly understand it. Any kind of narrative where it has a lot of different named characters, named places, named like scientific laws, if you're getting very complex, like
yeah. I mean,
things
a
where
good example
you
of
can
that
study
would be
them.
the Elder Scrolls game. Sorry, the Elder Scrolls games.
yeah.
They're all very deep because you can end up with like an entire library full of books which have history and lore in them. And
But none of them are relevant.
but
Yeah, like the
yeah, I
core
mean,
narrative is very, very simple.
yeah, it's not very complex. It's quite deliberately very uncomplex to go through. So yeah, that's a good example of that. I mean, Dragon Age is another one. Mass Effect. I would say I don't want to kind of
Yeah, most
generalize
Western
in
games are pretty simple.
not Western games, but Western RPGs. I feel they're all they lean heavily into the depth because there's a lot of writing in them. There's a lot of that's kind of storytelling, but yeah, they're not complex. They're not thematically, uh, particularly thematically rich. They generally have one or two kind of core ideas and kind of stick to that. Whereas the Japanese games tend to be the other way around. They tend to be fairly philosophically dense, but they don't have books and books of lore to unlock or find as you go and kind of play. And funnily enough, I actually used to find that annoying in a sense. I wanted, because I
Did
like
you
the
read the
books.
Skyrim books?
Yeah, no, I like to collect the books in Skyrim and Morrowind and
Did you see
whatever.
the Brian David
And
Gilbert video where he read every book and went insane?
I actually I really like that. I do like that. So I do like having my library, and whenever I play one of those games, I'm always looking for books to steal and or
So
buy.
you're who
But
therefore?
but then I would wish there was a point where I was wishing that those kinds of things were in the Japanese RPGs as well, because I felt like it was missing from them. I've since come around on that. I don't think
You've not
they
played
needed it
Eternal
all,
Sonata?
but no, I have not played that Eternal Sonata.
Don't. It's really bad, but it's great.
But yeah, I don't think that anymore. But something like Xenoblade Chronicles or whatever is kind of the opposite. It's very complex philosophically, but not particularly deep in the lore.
Yeah. I disagree. Oh
The lore's
no,
quite
Matt.
deep.
The lore is deeper than you could possibly
No,
imagine.
it's not that.
It's a
It's not that
nightmare.
deep. The lore doesn't
You
extend.
know about the guy, Klaus?
Yeah, the lore doesn't extend that far beyond what the events of the game are. You know, it's not.
No, I
It
hard disagree on
does.
that one.
No,
I hate
That's the hardest disagree.
some of them
No.
are like, this character has this sword and he says this line when he fights you, and that's plot significant because of an event that happened 2 games ago.
Yeah, within the games.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Like they're quite self-contained.
It
Whereas
seems like
No,
more
'cause
like
again,
a
you still have all
major-
the Earth stuff.
Skyrim has like a book that you'll find that'll be talking about a story for a game that's never, that's never going to be turned into a
Oh, I
game.
kind of see what you mean. Like it has
Yeah.
additional information for things that aren't immediately relevant to your quest.
Yeah, it's like the idea behind Skyrim and whatever was to use those books to create a world that was beyond the experience of you as the player or the character in it. Whereas most Japanese RPGs, and I do include the Xenoblade Chronicles games in that, they're more focused on what happens to the characters in the party. And the world building occurs purely through their experiences. So there's not like this sense of there being stuff outside of their journey.
That's really interesting. I've never thought about it that way, but you're exactly right. Now that I think about like every Final Fantasy game with crazy deep narratives, nothing outside of the actual main character's story matters at all to this world.
I mean, Final Fantasy XIII is the ultimate example of that, right? You've got two worlds. Like Final Fantasy XIII occurs across 2 worlds, and in cutscenes, you're seeing huge cities, and the world below is meant to be like this kind of ancient place and whatever, but the entire game is
Not relevant at all.
what those
Yeah.
6
Yeah.
characters experience, and that is all you see in it. So you don't get a sense of what's happening outside of their journey. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. It's just a different approach. It might be. It may well be why you didn't connect with it.
Yeah, it's genuinely like, what about the Lucy that don't fulfill the Falsi's wish in the game? Just like, who gives a shit? Or like in Final Fantasy, it's like, what happened to people in Midgar after Cloud left? And the game's like, who gives a shit, right? Like, who cares?
And it
They were
means
crushed by the fucking plate.
it means
Die.
that with those games, those games, whether you like them or not depends entirely on whether you like the characters, because the characters are everything. That is the pure storytelling mechanic. Whereas with something like most Western RPGs, you don't need to like the characters really.
Is that you don't have a character, or like your main character is
always a
nothing.
blank slate.
It's you.
Yeah, exactly.
What you need to like with those games is the world that they're in. That is everything. So a good example of that is Mass Effect. I mean, with Mass Effect,
you're right.
the original trilogy, I loved because I loved the universe that they depicted, and exploring those spaces was the experience for me. Mass Effect Andromeda, I absolutely hated because nothing about that world building really appealed to me.
But is
Do
that
you
what
think
makes the
that's
Western?
because of the influence? Sorry, go for it.
Oh, I was going to ask, do you think that makes the Western games easier to understand then? Because you experience the worlds as effectively you, and the world's details are relevant to you and your quest. Whereas the Japanese games, you're reading about someone else's story. And so you need to be engaged with that person, and you don't feel it happening to yourself.
I think so. I mean, I think the great thing about Western RPGs is you do get placed directly into the experience, and therefore, by going out and learning about the world, you're kind of more organically taking the information in. Whereas a lot of Japanese RPGs are much more about they're more like sitting down to read a book, where there is a kind of a distance between the player and the experience, and whether you connect with that or not really depends on, or whether you like the game or not depends if you can connect with the storytelling medium that they've used. So
but even like the
it's
plot
more
twists and
abstract.
things.
It's much more abstract, I guess, is what I'm saying. The idea of most Western RPGs is to be more real and grounded, and the idea of kind of Japanese RPGs tends to be to be quite abstract and be literary in approach.
Do you think then that the impact of D&D on early Japanese RPGs, do you think that's what's caused that? And like the dynamics of like having the important people being the party members? Do you think there's a link between that?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Because
Because
remember back in way back when,
yeah,
the fundamental differences between Western RPGs and Japanese RPGs is basically Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest versus Wizardry, right? And
yeah.
right from those days, you could see the different approach to bringing Dungeons and Dragons into the video game medium. So the Japanese saw it
Hmm.
as a storytelling experience, right? So Dungeons and
Yeah.
Dragons was about telling people a story, and then you would get your characters, and they'd all be named, at least after the first examples of these games. But from the second ones on, they'd have names, they'd have characters, they'd have personalities, and it would be about being pulled through that story. Whereas the wizardry or the Western side of these things was all about you taking
Like
control of your
Ultima and shit like
character.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was all that was important. Your direct control of the space that you're in. So yeah, it's really fascinating that,
In one you play as the DM and the other you play as a character.
yeah, in a way, yes. Yeah,
Well, I think
exactly.
one you play as a character, and the other you watch someone else's campaign.
Yeah, that's probably the better way of putting it, I'd say.
Okay. Interesting little design changes between different
There would
cultures.
be a
That's very
fascinating
cool.
study in there for some PhD student at some stage about why the Western developers, approached the RPG the way they did versus the Japanese, and kind of the different cultural reasons
Yeah.
for that. Because yeah,
Probably also like
there is
capitalism
some.
comes into it as well, because the Western companies actually license the original character creation methodology in their games, whereas the Japanese games didn't try to make their own kind of character creation. They just went with you have a character.
You're playing as Firion. He sucks. Sucked in.
Any game with a character creation is usually going to be like a very weak world building game experience. I usually find like it's all about centered on you've created this character, what you're gonna like experience the world through that. And I usually find that they're very frustrating. Like I didn't play Final Fantasy Online or whatever it was because I basically spent like an hour in the character creation going, what is it trying to make me want? Do I want to be this class? Do I want to be this character? Do I want to do these customizations? Because I'm like, what experience will actually give me the best experience in the game rather than saying, okay, well, here's a character, you can experience it, and here's the story elements dropping in. It's more like, oh, well, I've made a character which is like an orc who's like 2 feet, who's like going to like cast magic spells and has giant boobs, but all of a sudden like that's like a horrible experience. Like
There's
that's
there's
I
an
think you just don't
interesting
like MMOs, Trent.
there's an interesting example of that. The Neo series, which is 2 games. One of them, the original Neo is a named character. You don't get any control over his design or whatever. It's William Adams.
Samurai.
Yeah.
Yeah, William Adams.
Samurai Bill. And then in the second one,
Yeah.
they go to character creation. So you create a character, and then that character is placed in the world. And the difference in what it does to the storytelling is really interesting, because with Neo 1, the developer knows exactly what your character is, right? And that in cutscenes and interactions, they're talking directly to William Adams, and there is that kind of experience where he is the character. Whereas with Neo 2, it's all very passive because they don't know who that character is. So it's like the events are happening all around that character, and because they can't address that character directly, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's definitely, it changes the tone of the story and the approach that they
I
need to
find
take to
most of
telling
those
that story.
games, especially Western ones, they're very meme based. Like things like Saint Row, it's like it's all about how horrible is your character going to look, or how much like crap you can jam into it to make it a hilarious experience. So then the game is built around you're going to make a character which is just a giant laughing meme for the streamers rather than
That's
an engaging like story.
that's what someone YouTuber mentioned this. It might have been from a guy. Knows about how the more outlandish your character creation allows you to be, the more the game becomes you playing it rather than actually telling the story the game wants to tell. It becomes kind of the player being forced to bend, or the game being forced to bend itself to the player's will. The game needs to accept whatever the player tells it to do, rather than the game itself telling the player, this is the story I want you to tell, and this is what I want you to focus on and enjoy. And perhaps it also leads into the difference too.
It's like, always it's kind of ceding control. The more the developer cedes control to the player, the less the developer can do. It's the same issue with kind of open worlds, actually. The more open you make the world, the less you can be sure what the player is going to be doing in that world, so the less you can actually do to that player with that world. Which is why Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom are kind of so fascinating examples, because they find a solution to that problem. But the basic problem that open world games at Ubisoft and EA and all the rest of them find is they can't tell a good story because they can't be sure what the player's doing at any point in time.
So I think that's what Final Fantasy XVI is trying to resolve with this lore thing. Is it's almost suggesting we're not going to bend anything to the player's whim. This is how our story is going to run.
Yeah, it's
and
kind
we
of
will not we will not bend to you.
It's kind of like, it seems to me, like you say, that they're saying, look, we're not going to compromise the story. We're going to tell the story we want to, but we're going to make it easy for you to keep up with what we're doing. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I would like for developers to be able to control the story more.
It's
because
why
I feel
the original Watch Dogs was the best Watch Dogs, because it was less about tuber
Oh, that's
sort of
so
Gen
wrong.
Z crap.
That's so
it was
Watch Dogs is a really good example of a not good open world game.
All it did
trend.
wrong was have a mopey guy during the time where everyone's like, I don't want games which are all about mopey, depressive, and like murdering people. That's like the only reason why it was shit. It's like mechanics. It's how it leaned into the story was way better than the other 3 games.
Trent, I played the entire thing of Watch Dogs. I cannot remember a single story beat of that game. That game is not a good narrative.
You're like you've got like a deadbeat dad, and you're like you fuck up, and like like it.
There is only one scene. There is only one scene in Watch Dogs I remember, and it was like you went out into suburbia and went into a house, and I can't even remember what you did in that house. Whether you killed people or people were already dead, one or the other.
Well, that's the choice. You could kill people. You could not. You could save them. That was your whole rampage. You didn't have to be on a rampage.
That's not a good story, Trent.
It's
a good example of
interest.
It's a good example of really bad storytelling in video games. I'm sorry to just kind of
if I didn't delete my article from so many years ago, I would have been able to show you that it's a good conceptual game and that it was the best Watch Dogs.
No, there might have been a seed of an idea in there that might have been interesting, but no. It's a Ubisoft the game.
No, it is.
Watch Dogs 2 at least like tried to do stuff.
No, it was like YouTube generation suddenly like leaked into the game. It's everything Ubisoft.
Why is that a bad thing? It's
everything Ubisoft was doing around the time where it was like for the gamers and for the streamers, like bullshit into their like marketing strategy, and that was leaking into their games and causing this like horrible experience where it wasn't really for the gamers. Like that is like it just was
nothing
Ubisoft
has ever done has been for the gamers. Everything Ubisoft has ever done has been for the profits.
No. Don't you remember when E3 happened?
I don't
remember. They were all sad and they were like, we're gonna be bought out, and like everyone sympathized with them, and it was great. That was like
I'm really sorry. I love that you're trying to like win this, but my guy, I don't know if you can.
I'm sorry, Trent, but no.
And then like 2 years later, it got pulled out, like all this shit that Ubisoft was doing horrible, and like maybe they should have been bought out by like that TV company. And
Ubisoft is the Gollum of video game developers.